The weak and distant sun of Mars illuminated the underground colony where the few settlers tried to make a barren and hostile planet a new home. Mars, in 2087, was not the promising place of exploration that scientists had imagined. It was a survival field. During the endless days of work, Isaac, a restless miner, watched the horizon of gray concrete and the vast red landscapes in the distance. Despite his daily life on Mars, something was wrong. He didn't know what it was, but he felt that time was repeating itself. On the 12th morning, Isaac woke up with an all-too-familiar feeling. The smell of instant coffee on the coffee table. The sound of the other settlers' metal boots echoing in the colony's corridors. The weight of the headphones as the daily announcements played. Every detail seemed familiar. As if he had experienced all of this before. Isaac furrowed his brow but quickly pushed the feeling away. It wouldn't be the first time that loneliness and monotony would make him lose focus. Still, he couldn't ignore the idea that, for some inexplicable reason, that moment was repeating itself. He went down to the excavation room, where the miners spent long hours drilling into the Martian soil in search of resources. There, once again, the same scene repeated itself, the team leader, Carl, giving orders to the workers. But something didn't seem right. When Isaac entered, Carl looked directly at him and said, with a strange familiarity, "You're late, Isaac." Again. Isaac stopped, bewildered. He hadn't been late, but Carl's words echoed in his mind as if he had heard them before. In reflex, he looked at the other faces in the room, the same expressions, the same gestures, as if they were stuck in the same scene. Something was wrong. More than ever, he felt like he was reliving the same moments over and over again. As the day went on, the feeling of déjà vu intensified. During the meal, Isaac realized he was about to say the same phrase he always said, "The work is more exhausting today." He stopped mid-sentence, perplexed, and looked at the others. They all had the same blank expression, as if they were going through the same words and feelings as always. "Are you okay, Isaac?" asked Clara, one of the miners, breaking the silence. She wasn't really asking about his emotional state but about the rhythm of his breathing, the way he was behaving. "Yeah," he replied quickly, lacking confidence. "Just a little tired." But Isaac knew it wasn't tiredness. It was the feeling of being trapped in a cycle, an endless repetition of events, as if time was distorting around him. Something was happening, but no one seemed to notice. Or maybe everyone was pretending they didn't see it. When the workday ended, Isaac went to his small room and tried to focus. He had to understand what was going on. He couldn't keep living like this, as if he were stuck in an infinite loop. But every time he tried to organize his thoughts, the feeling of déjà vu returned, stronger, more insidious. What was he living? And, worse yet, what should he do to break this cycle? Before sleeping, Isaac looked at the ceiling of his small chamber, the same details always before his eyes. The same dim light from his control panel. The same heavy breathing of the other settlers echoing through the thin walls. He closed his eyes, trying to escape this mental prison that seemed to surround him. But as he closed his eyes, he had the impression that the next day would be the same. As if everything was about to start again, endlessly. The next day began, as always, with the feeling of déjà vu still lingering in his mind. Isaac got up, unsurprised, for another cycle. The same smell of instant coffee, the familiar sound of the colony waking up. But there was something different, something inexplicable that he couldn't ignore. What was going on with his mind? Why did the repetition of his routine feel so cruel? Determined to push the thought away, Isaac headed to the mine again, where work awaited him. Today, he was tasked with exploring a new underground cavity, an area that had been unknown until then. The other miners spread out across the galleries, their headlamps lighting up the rough, desolate walls of Mars. It was then that he saw it. In the deepest corner of the mine, hidden under a layer of rocks and earth, something caught his attention. A faint and mysterious glow emanated from a hole in the wall. Isaac approached cautiously, feeling an urgency that compelled him to investigate. He removed the rocks with his hands, with the help of a shovel, until the glow intensified, revealing a crystal-shaped object, unexplained in its presence there. It was a small artifact, almost the size of a human hand. Its surface appeared polished and smooth, despite its apparent age. The material was unknown. Isaac looked around, feeling a growing tension. The artifact was untouched, as if it had been waiting for his arrival. Carefully, he picked up the object, and as he did, a wave of energy coursed through his body, like an electric shock. The glow of the crystal intensified, lighting up the entire dark gallery around him. Isaac instinctively stepped back, but something pulled him back, as if the artifact had an invisible force, a magnetism that couldn't be ignored. Suddenly, a holographic projection appeared before him. The images floated in the air, clear and detailed, showing Mars millennia ago. It wasn't the desolate and cold Mars he knew, but a vibrant landscape, with grand cities and imposing structures, a place inhabited by humans who seemed to live there naturally. The images showed people in exotic garments, speaking to each other in a language Isaac didn't recognize. Then, the images began to change, and something much more sinister emerged. The hologram now showed a group of people gathered in a dark room, their faces marked by fear. Isaac, a voice echoed in the room, and he froze. It was a human voice, but strangely distorted, as if speaking directly to him. Do not touch the artifact. Do not continue, or everything that happened to us will happen to you. You must destroy it. The words seemed to invade his mind, as if he could hear them in his own head rather than in the room around him. Isaac looked around the gallery, but there was no one else. He was alone, still holding the artifact, the projection slowly fading away. A cold shiver ran down his spine. Destroy it, Isaac, the voice came again, more desperate. Our fate will be yours, and you will be consumed by it. Mars is not what it seems. Before he could process what was happening, the hologram vanished. The artifact stopped glowing and remained still in his hands, as if nothing had happened. Isaac was panting, his palms sweaty, his heart pounding. He looked at the object, still not believing what he had just experienced. But deep down, he knew that something was terribly wrong. The gallery fell silent. Nothing but the sound of his own breathing. Isaac stood there for a few minutes, unsure of what to do. The voice, the images, the desperate plea to destroy the artifact, he couldn't simply ignore that. Finally, with a burst of courage, he took the artifact to the center of the colony. As he walked through the narrow corridors, his mind was still in turmoil. He had no answers, but he had a strong feeling that this was far from an accident. The artifact wasn't from Mars, that was clear. But what did it really mean? And why did the voice keep asking him to destroy it? When he reached the colony's research lab, Isaac was met by Clara, the scientist in charge of analyzing newly discovered resources. She looked at the artifact with interest, but something in her gaze told him that she also felt the gravity of the situation. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice full of curiosity and apprehension. Isaac hesitated for a moment. "At the bottom of the mine," he replied, his voice tense. I don't know what it is, but you have to see it. What I saw, that wasn't normal." Clara looked at him, then at the artifact, and before she could say more, she murmured, "This is something much older than anything we've ever seen. And it seems to be reacting to you." Isaac felt a chill run down his spine. What exactly was happening to him, to the artifact, and to Mars? Questions began to flood his mind like an avalanche, but one thing was clear, he couldn't ignore the voice's plea, or this would become far more dangerous than he ever imagined. The following days passed like a thick fog for Isaac. The artifact was now under constant surveillance, but even so, he couldn't stop thinking about the voice he had heard. The warning, the desperate plea to destroy the object, continued to hammer in his mind. Clara was studying the artifact, but Isaac couldn't shake the feeling that time was dragging on in a strange way. Something wasn't right. It was as if he were trapped in a place that never changed. Each day, the feeling of déjà vu intensified, as if he were reliving the same moments in an even more oppressive way. The people around him seemed oblivious, or worse, were trying to ignore it, but Isaac knew something was deeply wrong. He felt like he was being dragged into an endless abyss, a spiral of repeating events, and at the center of this spiral was the artifact. At night, when the day came to an end and the colony prepared to rest, the nightmares began. They were not ordinary nightmares, but something much more disturbing, visceral. Isaac found himself in a vast desert, a never-ending Martian landscape. The sky was tinged with a dark red, as if the planet itself were burning. The feeling of isolation was overwhelming, and a strange sense of oppression hung in the air. He walked alone across the surface, aimlessly, until he saw something in the distance, a hooded figure, dressed in black, covered by fine dust that seemed alive. The figure watched him, its eyes hidden in the shadows, but something in its gaze seemed eerily familiar. Isaac felt a shiver run down his spine when he realized the figure was moving toward him. "You are lost, Isaac," the figure said, with a distorted, echoing voice. With every word, the black dust stirred around him, and the feeling of suffocation grew stronger. "Who are you?" Isaac shouted, trying to step back, but his feet felt heavy, as if the ground were holding him in place. "I am you," the figure replied, its voice now becoming clearer and more distant, as if it were moving away from Isaac. "I am the reflection of your destiny, what you will become." Isaac felt his throat tighten, and a sense of panic spread through his body. "No, it can't be," he whispered, trying to understand what was happening. But before he could process it, the black dust surged forward, enveloping him, consuming him completely. He woke up in his room, panting, his heart pounding. It was a nightmare, he knew that. But the feeling of terror wouldn't go away. Something deep in his mind told him he wasn't just dreaming. The black dust, the figure, everything felt too real, too intense to be just an illusion. The next day, as the colonists began their work, Isaac couldn't shake the feeling that the nightmare wasn't just a projection of his mind. He felt as if he were being followed, watched, and worst of all, he had the sensation that, somehow, he was becoming the figure from his nightmare. It was becoming harder to distinguish reality from dreams. The colony seemed more suffocating, the walls closing in around him. Isaac went to Clara in the lab and found her examining the artifact's data, her eyes tired, but with a worried expression. When he entered, she looked at him and paused. "Are you okay?" she asked, doubt in her voice. "No, Clara. I'm not okay," Isaac replied, his voice tense. I saw something. It's not just a nightmare. That thing I saw in my mind, in the dust, it's trying to tell me something." Clara seemed to hesitate for a moment, but then she spoke seriously. "Isaac, you have to understand, that's not just an artifact. It's a manifestation of something much older. Mars isn't what we think. The things happening, the distortions, the déjà vus, they're connected to the artifact. And I think it's trying to communicate with you." "Communicate? How?" Isaac asked, now more confused than ever. "I don't know," Clara replied, her voice now grave. "But what I do know is that by touching that object, you've connected to something much bigger. Not just Mars past, but something that transcends time. And this thing, it's trying to take you, Isaac." Those words hit Isaac like a punch to the stomach. He felt the weight of them, and a new wave of panic washed over him. The nightmare, the distorted figures, the voices whispering in his head, was all of that real? Or was he losing his sanity? He tried to calm down, but the fear kept growing. Suddenly, a strange feeling took over Isaac. He felt as though he were being watched, as if someone or something was behind him. He quickly looked at Clara, who was distracted with the artifact. And it was in that moment that he saw it. The black dust, in its distorted form, was beginning to form, slow and relentless, in his peripheral vision. Isaac turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Just the emptiness of the Martian colony. But he knew, for certain, that something was approaching. Something he couldn't escape. The feeling that something was about to happen hung in the air. Isaac could no longer ignore the growing sense of dread that followed him like a shadow at every step. The black dust, which now seemed to be a constant presence in his thoughts, began to invade his field of vision in increasingly disturbing ways. It wasn't just in the nightmare that it consumed him, it seemed to be starting to emerge in the real world, blending with reality. When he left the lab, the colony's corridor felt narrower, the walls closer. The emergency lights flickered at regular intervals, creating an even more surreal feeling. But what terrified him the most was the fact that the people around him were beginning to act strangely. They no longer greeted him as they had before. Their faces were distorted, their gazes empty, as if they were trapped in an endless cycle, just like the one he was experiencing. Isaac tried to talk to Clara, but she seemed distant, as if something had taken her essence away. Her words were becoming more and more monotonous, as if she were repeating what she had already said on previous occasions, without realizing she was doing so. The air in the colony was heavy, and Isaac knew time was running out. He needed to understand what was happening before it was too late. The feeling of being watched only grew stronger. At every corner, in every hallway, he felt the eyes of the colony focused on him, waiting for something he still didn't understand. That night, he couldn't sleep. The images of the black dust, the distorted figures watching him, became more vivid, more real. He found himself again in the Martian desert, with the red sky stretching above him. The hooded figure appeared before him, its eyes glowing in a dark hue. The black dust, as if alive, surrounded it, making it even more menacing. "You're too close, Isaac," the voice said, with an intensity that made his body tremble. "We cannot allow you to go further. If you continue, you will lose control. Everyone will lose." He tried to scream, but his voice wouldn't come out. The feeling of suffocation took over his throat, as if something was holding him back, preventing him from breathing. Suddenly, he woke up, but the relief of waking was brief. The nightmare hadn't left him. He was back in the colony, but the atmosphere seemed even denser. The shadows on the walls seemed to move, and the people around him were becoming increasingly distorted, more unreal. As if they had been taken over by the same dust that had dominated his mind. Isaac looked for Clara again, determined to find out what was happening. When he found her, her expression was one of complete apathy. She stood in front of the colony's control panel, staring blankly at the screen, unaware of what was in front of her. Her eyes were empty, lifeless. "Clara, what's happening?" Isaac asked, his voice trembling. She didn't respond. She didn't move a muscle. Isaac began to panic. What was happening to her? To all of them? He touched her shoulder, and the reaction was instant. Clara slowly turned around, her eyes now as empty as a cave. Then, she spoke, with a chilling calmness, the words Isaac had feared to hear. "There's no escape anymore, Isaac. The dust will consume all of us." He recoiled, panic overtaking his body. Clara's voice wasn't hers. It was the same voice he had heard in the nightmare, the voice that had warned him about what was to come. It was as if everyone around him was being taken over by the same curse that the artifact carried. Before he could say anything else, the control panel screen flickered, and a holographic image appeared. It was a hologram of Mars, but it wasn't the desolate Mars he knew. It was an ancient version of the planet, with thriving cities and vibrant life. But as he watched, the images began to distort, becoming darker and darker, as if something were corrupting reality itself. In the center of the projection, a figure appeared, the same hooded figure Isaac had seen in his nightmares. It looked directly at him, its eyes glowing with a terrifying intensity. "Isaac," the figure said, its voice echoing through the colony. "You can no longer escape. The artifact was made to trap all those who dared touch it. And now, you will be part of our prison. Mars is not just a planet. It's an eternal prison." Isaac felt his body freeze. He looked around, the other colonists now silent, motionless. They were all being consumed by the same force he feared. The black dust was no longer just a nightmare, but a living presence surrounding them. "Destroy the artifact, Isaac," the figure said. "Or all of you will be consumed. There's no time left." But Isaac knew he had no choice. The artifact was the key, the only thing that could stop what was happening. He needed to destroy that object before it was too late. Before everyone was taken by the black dust, by the prison Mars had become. The atmosphere in the colony was unrecognizable. A sense of hopelessness gripped everyone, as if the very air was saturated with an oppressive sadness. Isaac could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was an illusion. The voices of the black dust, which once seemed distant, were now inside his head, whispering constantly. The hooded figure, that terrifying presence he could no longer push away, continued to manifest in his thoughts. He could no longer ignore the fact that the artifact had caused something far deeper. Something that was altering the very fabric of reality. The hologram still remained fixed on the control panel screen, the distorted image of Mars showing a civilization that no longer existed, but seemed to exist simultaneously. The hooded figure stared at him, its piercing eyes conveying a clear message, yet filled with urgency and terror. "You have no choice anymore, Isaac. If you don't destroy the artifact, all of you will be consumed, and Mars will become your tomb." Isaac looked at Clara, but she seemed so distant, so disconnected, just like all the other colonists around him. It was as if a part of them had already been consumed, taken by the same curse that loomed over the artifact. He knew something was happening inside them. They were becoming part of something much larger, something they couldn't understand. The black dust seemed to be taking control of his mind, as if it were trying to erase him slowly. With every breath, he felt closer to losing control. He looked at the artifact, still under a force field at the center of the lab, imposing and silent. The idea of destroying it didn't make sense, but the words of the hooded figure echoed in his mind: "Destroy the artifact or all will be consumed." What he didn't know was that, if he destroyed it, he would be condemning himself and the others irreversibly. The artifact was not just a key to the prison on Mars, it was also a vital link that kept the balance. If it were destroyed, Mars would not only become an eternal cemetery, but the planet itself would begin to disintegrate, taking all the colonists with it. He took a step forward, the weight of the decision crushing his shoulders. What should he do? The artifact was clearly involved in the visions, the nightmares, and perhaps, if he destroyed it, the colonists could be freed from this mental prison. But, at the same time, he knew that destroying the artifact could mean the end of everything. The thought of destroying what seemed to be the only hope was unbearable. "Isaac, you have to stop," Clara said, her voice now cold and distant. She approached him slowly, as if guided by something invisible. "If you destroy the artifact, it will be the end of all of us. We can't go back." He turned to her, desperate. "But what about the nightmares, Clara? The distortions? The black dust? We can't keep going like this. We can't keep being trapped in this cycle." Clara shook her head, her eyes now clouded. The artifact keeps us trapped here, but it's also the only thing stopping us from succumbing to the dust. If you destroy it, we'll lose the only link to our humanity. Isaac felt a lump form in his throat. How could he make this decision? How could he choose between the slow and suffocating death they were living or the destruction of everything they knew? He went to the control panel and looked at the artifact, his eyes fixed on the glowing structure that seemed to pulse as if it had a life of its own. Suddenly, a strange thought crossed his mind. Maybe it wasn't about destroying the artifact. Maybe it was about releasing what it was holding. The artifact seemed to be trapping something, or someone. What would happen if he released it? Isaac felt a wave of understanding invade his mind. Perhaps the artifact was the key to freeing all the colonists, but not in a simple way. Perhaps it would require a sacrifice to break the cycle, something beyond the physical destruction of the object. The artifact had a purpose, but to achieve it, he would need to go beyond simple destruction. Something inside Isaac told him that if he could release the force contained within, the nightmare he was living would have a chance to be broken. He turned again to Clara. "I understand what we need to do. We can't destroy the artifact. We need to release it." She looked at him with an empty expression, but something in her eyes seemed to confirm that she already knew what Isaac was about to do. Without another word, he approached the artifact, feeling the pressure building in his lungs, as if the very colony were tightening around him. He touched the object, and as he did, something that had seemed dormant inside him awakened. The black dust began to stir, swirling around his body, but now, instead of suffocating him, it seemed to respond to him, as if it had recognized his presence. "Isaac, don't do this!" Clara shouted, but her words were distant, as if they came from another world. The presence of the artifact intensified, and Isaac felt a wave of cold energy invade his body. He was ready to release what had been trapped, but he knew this would not come without a price. The colony, the artifact, and even Mars itself were about to be tested. The necessary sacrifice would be great. But he had no choice. He couldn't allow the dust to continue consuming everyone around him. He could no longer allow them to live in an eternal nightmare. Isaac didn't know what awaited him after touching the artifact, but one thing was certain: the moment of decision had arrived. As his hand made contact with the glowing surface, the air around him transformed, as if time itself had frozen. He felt an intense pressure, as though the weight of the entire universe was concentrated on his shoulders. And then, a wave of cold energy coursed through his body, sending chills down his spine. The black dust, which had once pursued him, began to stir frantically, forming spirals that intertwined around him, growing thicker and denser. It was no longer trying to consume him, but now seemed to be reacting, as if being pulled toward the artifact. The shadows that had once moved along the walls began to gather, swirling around him, becoming a pulsating mass of darkness that seemed to be alive. Suddenly, a voice echoed in his mind, not from the hooded figure, but from something far older, deeper. It was an indescribable presence, something that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. The sensation of being lost in the vastness of Mars, of being absorbed into an infinite void, enveloped him completely. The voice spoke, but its words were not filled with fear. Instead, they were delivered with a chilling clarity. "You've opened the portal, Isaac. Now there's no turning back. The dust is not just a prison. It is the essence of the planet, the guardian of Mars. If you release it, not only will you be consumed, but everyone around you will be as well. Mars has always been a prison, and now you are its new prisoner." Isaac tried to react, but he was trapped. The artifact, now vibrating in his hands, seemed to be pulling something from within him. He could no longer distinguish where his body ended and where the strange presence enveloping him began. The space around him seemed to distort, as if the very contours of the colony were unraveling. He looked at the other colonists, but they were frozen in place, like stone statues, their expressions vacant and apathetic. "You cannot overcome this," the voice said again. "The artifact was made to trap you, Isaac. It has always been a prison. And now you will become part of its construction." Isaac's body began to tremble, and he tried to fight against the growing pressure. The black dust became thicker, wrapping around him, its cold particles piercing his skin, his mind. He felt as if he was being stripped of his humanity, as if he was transforming into part of the planet itself. Terror consumed him as he realized that there was no going back. But just as the dust seemed ready to engulf him completely, a wave of energy surged, a bright and warm force cutting through the shadows. Isaac looked at the artifact, now starting to shine with a blinding intensity. It was as though the planet itself was reacting to that force, trying to rid itself of the prison he had unwittingly released. The black dust, once unbeatable, began to dissipate, its formless mass starting to disintegrate, as if being drawn into the artifact. It was then that the truth hit Isaac with full force. The artifact was not just a prison. It was a balance, a necessary link to keep the essence of Mars intact. If he destroyed it completely, or tried to escape without understanding this, the planet would disintegrate, taking everything with it. The black dust was, in fact, a guardian entity, not of evil, but of a cycle necessary for Mars's existence. The curse wasn't about destruction, it was about accepting the sacrifice. The dilemma Isaac faced was no longer about destroying or saving the artifact. It was about accepting that he would need to become Mars's new guardian. He felt an incomparable strength rise from within, as though the artifact was offering him the power to maintain the planet's essence, but at a cost he was not prepared to pay. "There's no way out," the voice spoke again, now with unmistakable sadness. "What's been done is done. Now, Mars needs you. And you need Mars." Isaac felt the weight of the power take over his body, an indescribable pain as though his soul was being shaped to serve a purpose greater than he could ever imagine. The colony around him began to disintegrate slowly, the walls crumbling, the black dust returning to its original form, but now without the same power. The artifact, with its pulsing light, began to release the energy that had imprisoned the planet for millennia. He closed his eyes, knowing that the decision had been made. There was no going back. The artifact was now in his hands, and he, Isaac, was the new guardian of Mars. He was no longer just a colonist. He had become part of the planet itself. The black dust, once a threat, was now his mission. He would not escape Mars. He was Mars. The light of the artifact began to dissipate, and darkness slowly returned, not as a threatening presence, but as an integral part of what Mars had become. Isaac could no longer distinguish what was real. The space around him, the colony, everything seemed to unravel into layers of dust and shadows. He felt a profound emptiness, not only in his mind but in his soul, as if the very essence of his being was merging with the planet. Images of the past began to overlap with his present. He saw the first colonists, their faces marked by years of struggle, but also by the understanding that Mars was not a new home, but a prison. The black dust was not an enemy, but a guardian force, one that kept the cycle of Mars's existence intact. These colonists, thousands of years ago, had tried to escape, but had failed, each one becoming part of the great cycle of renewal the planet required. And now, Isaac was the new guardian. He looked at his companions, their faces now distorted by the black dust, their expressions frozen in a state of despair. Clara, one of the few still standing, approached him, her gaze lost. She didn't recognize Isaac, or perhaps she recognized him in a completely different way. The pain and fear that had once been evident on her face had now vanished, as if she had been consumed by the same darkness that overtook the planet. Isaac tried to speak, but his words didn't come out, as if the air around him was swallowing his voice. The black dust, now calm, seemed to have reorganized. The air that had once been heavy and dense was now lighter, but at the same time, the planet seemed emptier. What Isaac didn't know was that releasing the artifact had closed a cycle. The release wasn't just about freeing those who had been trapped, it was about accepting that Mars would never be a home. It was, in fact, an eternal corridor of cycles of birth and destruction, where the beings that inhabited it were part of a great system that regenerated itself, perpetuating forever. Isaac felt a presence beside him. It was the hooded figure, the one he had seen in his nightmares. Now, it was no longer distant, but beside him, like a shadow projected by his own being. "You freed the artifact," the figure said, its voice no longer a threat, but a painful acknowledgement. "Now you understand. What is trapped on Mars cannot be destroyed. It is part of the universe's balance. You cannot escape. None of us can." Isaac wanted to scream, but the sound died in his throat. He was trapped. They were all trapped. The colony, the artifact, the black dust, everything was part of an eternal cycle. He was no longer just a miner, a colonist. He was part of Mars's very fabric. His identity, his thoughts, his memories, everything was now intertwined with the planet. He was the essence of Mars, and Mars was his prison. The sky above him was empty, without stars, without light. He looked to the horizon, where the vast Martian landscape stretched out. The red desert seemed endless, and the feeling of being lost in an infinite vastness consumed him. The cycle had begun again, but now, Isaac was a part of it. He could no longer leave Mars. He could no longer escape the fate that had been laid out for him. He would not be the last. No colonist would be. And in some way, Isaac understood what the previous colonists had understood before him. The only way to survive was to become part of the planet itself. The black dust, the darkness, the artifact, all of it was not something to be destroyed or escaped. They were the key to keeping the cycle alive. It was an eternal prison, but one with a much greater purpose than he could ever fully comprehend. Clara looked at him with an empty gaze, and in her eyes, Isaac saw the reflection of his own condemnation. He knew what needed to be done. The cycle would continue, and he was now an essential part of it. He no longer had an individual destiny. He and the other colonists, those still breathing, were irreparably trapped in a cycle of rebirth and destruction. They had been marked by Mars. The wind on Mars, which had once seemed empty and lifeless, now seemed to whisper to him, as if speaking to him, reminding him that he was exactly where he was always meant to be. In that moment, Isaac was no longer a man. He was no longer a colonist. He was part of Mars, and Mars was his eternal prison. He took a deep breath, feeling the black dust around him. The darkness was no longer a threat. It was his identity now, and with that, he accepted his eternity.